Hi, in today's video we're going to look at using buttons to trigger samples. So this is a request I've had a few times actually, and it was requested recently by one of my patrons. So let's just jump in. We're going to add a sampler and we're going to add a front interface script. And let's just tidy this a bit so we have a bit more room to work with. Okay, and the first thing we'll do is we'll map some samples. So I've just created this project folder and we've got some samples in here, and these are just some samples I had from another project. These are actually some stylophone samples. So these are stylophone tap samples. These are just basically the stylus of the stylophone being tapped against the keys, and it just makes a little sort of spark sound. So we'll just drop those in, and it doesn't matter too much where we do that, but let's put them on to middle C, so that's MIDI note 60. So let's just see, yeah, so we're on middle C there, C3. And I'm just going to turn this down a bit and let's just trigger those samples. So you can hear they're just like a sort of clicking sound. So we're going to add a button to our interface to trigger these samples. So let's just do that. We'll just add a button, very straightforward. And we'll call this button BTN trigger. Now we're going to turn save in preset off because we don't want it to trigger every time we compile the script. We only want it to trigger when we click the button. And we're also going to make it momentary. And what making it momentary does is it means we can click the button and when we release the mouse it will turn the button off. So on off, it doesn't latch on. If we turn is momentary off, then it will just latch. So we'll have is momentary enabled, and then we're going to create a custom callback definition. And all we're going to do in here is trigger the note to play back. And that's really easy. So we've got 4 notes. We're just going to get it to trigger middle C. So middle C, C3, that's MIDI note 60. And the command we use in the button's callback is synth.playNote. And we have to give it the note number and the velocity. So we'll just put note number 60 and we'll put the velocity of 64. The velocity doesn't actually matter for this setup because we don't have any velocity modulators, so the velocity isn't affecting the volume or anything. Okay, I'm going to hit F5, and now when I press this button, which we can see over here on the left, it's going to trigger the first sample here, C3. Now it's triggering when I release the button as well as when I click it. So we're getting 2 clicks, so let's make it so it only triggers when we press the button down, so when the button's turned on. And to do that we just put if value, which is the same as putting if value equals 1, but we don't need to put the equals 1. So we're saying if the button's on, then play a note, otherwise it won't do anything. So click, and now I'll release the mouse and we don't get anything. Okay, so far so good. Now these are just short samples. If we have a look in the wave editor, you can see these are just literally a sample of a click. There's no sustain here, and usually with these sort of pad-based instruments, you're probably going to be using percussion samples, which are going to be short, like this. Now if we're using longer samples, sustaining samples, pressing this button will just make that sample play until it reaches the end. And if it's a looped sample, it obviously won't have an end, it'll just play forever, and we don't want that, so we need to find a way to turn notes off as well. So let's just map some sustain samples. So I've got some in here as well. Again, they're just stylophone samples, so we'll just take those 4 there. I'm just working with 4 samples here, but obviously in a real world project you can have as many or as few as you like. So these ones are starting on, let's put them on the, we'll put them on the next C, so that's note 72 there, C4. So let's change this. Instead of triggering note 60, we'll trigger note 72 actually. And now it's going to trigger a sustaining sample, and we don't have a way to turn this off. So what I'll do, I'll let it play for a moment, and then I'm going to click this MIDI panic button up here in the top right, and that will prevent the sustain being indefinite. And I'll turn the volume down because this sample is probably going to be a bit loud. So you can see, even though I release the mouse, the note continued to play until I press the panic off, and that's not really what we're going to want most of the time. Although there are occasions when you're going to want a drone just playing in the background, maybe making a bagpipe library or something like that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to make so when you press the button, the sound turns on, as it does, and then when you release the button, the sound turns off. So we've already got a little if statement for when the button is pressed, so we need to add an else for when the button is released, and here we're going to turn off the note. Okay, so how do we turn off the note? Well, there are two ways. We can use the engine.allnotesoff command, but that will turn off all notes that are playing, and we may not want that. Or we can use synth.noteOffByEventID, and that will turn off just the one note. So that's what we're going to do. So we'll go synth noteOffByEventID, and then we have to give it the event ID. Now we haven't recorded the event ID yet, so we're going to make a variable. We're going to call it event ID, and then back in our callback, we're going to save the event ID created by synth.playNote in our new event ID variable. So we just do it like that, and then we can just have event ID in the noteOffByEventID command there. Okay, so now when I press this button, it will play as before, but as soon as I release the mouse, it will turn off the note. Okay, great, so that works just as we wanted. Obviously, with a real drum pad, you're going to want it to trigger more than one note, and you're probably going to have more than one pad. So in this case, we're going to use 4 buttons to trigger the 4 different notes that we have. So let's just duplicate this button 3 times. I've selected the button. I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate. And we'll do that 2 more times. And then we'll drag a box around all of those and just adjust the alignment. Now HISE has been very good, and it's numbered these buttons with the same name as the first one, but it's appended a number to them. So we've got trigger 1, 2, and 3. So the first one, I'm just going to change the name so that it has a 0 on the beginning. And if you've seen my other videos, you've seen me use this technique quite a lot to deal with bunches of controls that are related. So what we're going to do is we're going to gather all these buttons into an array. So we'll create the array, btn trigger. We'll have a loop. We're going to loop between 0 and 3. So that's 0 and I is less than 4. That's because we've got 4 buttons. And then we're going to just grab these components and stick them in the array. So btn trigger, and then we append I, which will fill in the number that goes on the end of each of the button names. We're also going to assign this callback to each of the buttons, so all 4 buttons will trigger the same callback. So we'll go btn trigger, I.setControlCallback, and then put in the name of the callback there, which I just copied and pasted. We can delete this line here now because we don't need to assign it there. Okay, I'll hit F5, and we shall now check that this works. Now currently each button is calling the same callback, and it isn't doing anything different, so every single button will trigger the same sample. But we're going to change that. We're going to have it trigger, button 0 will trigger the first sample, 1 will trigger the second sample, 2 the third sample, etc. And we're actually going to have it trigger these ones that are on middle C. So to do that, let's first of all revert this back to middle C. and we need to get the index of the button that was pressed. We need to know which button was pressed. Again, this is a technique I've used a lot in my other videos. So we're going to create a variable called index, and this is going to be equal to btn trigger. So that's the array that contains all the buttons. And then we're going to use the index of function to find out where the button is in that array. And the button is the component that's passed into this callback function. So this will basically churn out a number. If we click the first button, index is going to be 0. If we click the second button, it'll be 1, etc. Now what we can do, let's go back to our sample map. So our first sample is on note 60. Our second sample is on 61, 62, 63. And since we've got note 60 here, which is the first note that we have a sample map to, and index is either going to be 0, 1, 2, or 3, all we need to do is append index to 60, and it will trigger the correct note. So let's try that. Let's turn that up a bit. See if we can make a bit more room here. There we go. Okay, so that works really nicely, and it's a really simple way to make a pad. Now, of course, you've got 127 notes, so you could have 127 buttons and have them each trigger a different sample. But we also have the velocity dimension as well, which also has 127 values. So let's have a look at how we can trigger samples on different velocities. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move all of these down so they just take up the velocity range of 0 to 1. And these samples up here, the sustaining samples, I'm going to put those on the same range as the tap samples, but these are going to have a different velocity range. They're just going to go from 2 to 3. And we're going to have another set of buttons. I'm going to duplicate these buttons. So I've selected them all. I'm just going to press Ctrl and D. And let's just line these up. And they're not quite in order because for some reason 4 is at this end. So let's just sort those out. Okay, so now we've got 8 buttons, and we want the first layer of buttons to trigger our first layer of samples, and want our second layer of buttons to trigger our second layer of samples. So let's look at how we can do that. So we're going to still need a note offset based on the index, and we're going to change the name of that. We're going to create a new variable, and we'll call it note offset. And this is going to equal something. We'll look at that in a moment. And the other thing is we're now using a velocity range which starts on 1 and goes up to 2. Actually, it goes up to 3, but our samples are mapped on 0 to 1 and 2 and 3. So we can just think of it as 1 and 2 in this case. I've changed the starting velocity to 1, and we're going to add some sort of velocity offset here. And that's going to become our note offset here. So we're going to have another variable called velocity offset, which will equal something. Okay, so this is something that you're going to use probably whenever you do any kind of grid. So we've got a grid here of buttons, two layers, but it could have more layers and it could have more columns as well. But every time you do a grid, you're going to need to sort of take a range of numbers. So we've got 0 to 7, and conceptually you've got to treat it like it's actually a grid. It's not a linear run of 0 to 7. It's actually 2 layers of 4 like we've got here. And we've got to treat it like that in the code. And what we're going to use is we're going to use the modulus or modulo mathematical function. And we're also going to use division. So let me just show you that. I'm just going to comment out this stuff for now. So we're going to do a console print. This is just an example to show you what's going to be going on behind the scenes. So imagine we have button 1, let's say. So that will have an index of 1. So we imagine our index value here is 1. So we'll say 1. And we shall do a mod based on how many columns we have. And we've got 4 columns, so if we mod 4, and when I hit compile, what we're hoping to find out is which column, 0, 1, 2, or 3, the button with index 1 belongs to. And obviously the button with index 1, btn trigger 1, should belong to column 1. So I'm hoping when we hit compile, we're going to see 1 in the console. There we go, we see 1. And now let's try another one. If I put in button 6, we should see the answer 2, because that's column 2, 0, 1, 2. So let's try that. Let's put 6, hit compile, and we see 2, which is correct. So this is going to be our note offset. So it will always select the right column, which means it will always select the right column of our mapped samples as well. So let's move to that. So note offset will be index mod 4. And remember, it's 4 because we have 4 columns. If you have more columns, you need to change this number. And speaking of changing numbers, one other thing we need to do is where we have our loop here going from 0 to 4, we actually need to change that to 8 now because we've got 8 buttons. Now we need to do the velocity offset. And this is similar to the note offset, but instead of working out which column the button is in, we need to work out which row it is in. And again, let's do a little exercise with the console.print. So imagining the button index that we received, this index up here is, let's say it's 2. So that would be for button 2 here. And this time we're going to divide it by 4. So last time we were using the mod function, now we're using division. And let's just see what we get. So we get 0.5. Now if I change this to, let's say button 0 and divide by 4, we'll get 0. Button 1, we're obviously going to get 0.25. So it's not until we go to button 4, which is this one up here, do we get 1. And then everything after that, so button 5, will be higher than 1. Button 6 and button 7. So they're all 1. If we had another row, which would be button 8, it's then going to be 2 and above. So what we can use this for is we can round the answer we get, we can round it down, and then it'll either be 0 if it's in the first row, or it'll be 1 if it's in the second row. So let me show you that. Let's do math.floor, and that means that's the command to round a number downwards to the nearest whole number. So now if I hit compile, we've got button 4 here, which we know is in row 1. So obviously that gives us row 1. If I put in button 6, we should see 1 again. We get 1 again. So by using division, we can actually find out which row we're dealing with. So let's get rid of that. And we're going to use this for our velocity offset. So it's math.floor index divided by 4. Okay, now assuming I've got this all right, it should just work. So the bottom row of buttons should trigger the bottom row of samples. And the top row should trigger the top row of samples. So that works really nicely. And a little optimization we can make is all of these little sort of calculations we're doing here don't need to be done when we release the mouse in the else part of this if statement. They only need to be done when we press the mouse down. So let's just move those into here. Just a tiny little optimization, which doesn't make much difference at this stage, but it will make a slight difference for the next thing we're going to do. So we'll just move those in there. The functionality is still the same. So that's your basic sort of pad grid, and we're using buttons here, and obviously you can change the skin so you can make these buttons look any way you want. Generally, I'd advise you not to use buttons for this, unless, well, if you've only got like 8 like we've got here, it's not so bad. But if you're doing a larger pad, and if you want a bit more flexibility, I'd suggest you use a panel and mouse callback and paint routines, and I've got other videos on those subjects, so you can go and look at those to find out the sort of basics of how you do that. But either way, you're doing the grid, whether it's buttons or using a panel, the basic premise is the same as this. Okay, let's look at one other thing. Sometimes you're going to want, rather than having one button per sample, you might want a single button that can trigger multiple samples. So let's just add that now. Let's just add a new button. And we'll call this, let's just rename that. We'll call this BTN Seek Trigger. So this is going to trigger sequentially, let's say. And again, we'll turn off save and preset, and again, we'll make it momentary. And we're going to create a callback for this one. And for now, we're going to, we'll leave all this code here that we've already written, but I'm going to comment it out because we're not going to actually be using this at the moment. So just so we can focus on this new code that we're writing, I am going to copy the contents of this previous callback and paste it in there, but we don't need the index part because we're not dealing with an array of controls. And that's a good start. Okay, so what we're going to change basically is the note offset and the velocity offset. So let's say, let's just do a random sequence first of all. So we'll make it so it triggers a random note at a random velocity. So it can be any of the 8 notes basically that get triggered. And to do that, we're just going to call the math.randInt function to get a random integer between 0 and 4. And we'll do the same with the velocity offset, randint between 0 and 2. Actually, no, sorry, it's between 1 and 2. Actually, that should be between 0 and 1. And if I hit F5, hopefully that's correct. Let's just test this. So it should now just trigger any sort of combination of these. We're overshooting there. I've gone 1 too high on the, that should be 0 to 4. There we go. Okay, so that's working just as expected, just triggers them randomly. Now let's say we wanted to trigger a particular sequence, so rather than just triggering randomly, let's just trigger, we won't worry about the velocity, we're just going to trigger the second velocity for now. But of course we could change this and have control over the velocity as well, but we'll just trigger the second layer, and we're going to trigger the notes in order, so we'll trigger the first one, the second one, third one, fourth one, and then back to the beginning. And to do that, we're going to need to use this note offset again, but it has to be outside of this function because we're going to want to retain the value. And with a function like this, every time the function's triggered, the value is recreated. This variable is recreated, and we don't want that. We want to remember the value every time we come back in. So we're going to create this variable again outside. We'll create it here, and we'll default it to 0. And then what we'll do inside our callback is we'll have our note offset, and we're going to equal it to whatever the note offset already is, and we're going to add 1 to it. So it's counting up. It's going to start at 0, and then it's going to be 0 plus 1, and then the next time we press the button it will be 1 plus 1, and the next time we press it will be 2 plus 1, and so on. And we're going to put this in parentheses, and again we're going to use that mod command, the mod operator, and we'll put 4 there. And what this does is it counts up in a sequence from 0 to 4, but when it hits 4 it actually resets to 0, so it goes 0 1 2 3, 0 1 2 3, 0 1 2 3. So let's hit F5 and we'll press our button, and it should trigger this top layer only, and it will trigger them in order. So that seems to work pretty well. So for triggering the different velocity layers, obviously there are a number of ways to handle that, and I've shown you one way with this. If you are using panels, you could actually have it so depending on which part of the panel you press, it triggers a different velocity layer, a bit like an XY grid kind of thing. There's really a whole array of methods for how you would trigger these different samples. And in fact, I've just set a keyword, array. You could use an array to trigger them in a particular order and just have this button count up through the indexes. So instead of using it as a note offset, you could actually use it to trigger particular indexes that refer to elements in an array. There's really a lot of possibilities, and if you'd like to see a particular method, please let me know and I will see if I can put a video together demonstrating a particular way of doing this. But this is the general principle, and I'm hoping you'll be able to take this now and apply it in your own way to your own projects, and hopefully you'll trigger more interesting samples than these. To my Patreon supporters, thank you very much for the suggestion for this video. This project will be available to you on the Patreon page. And if you're not following me on Patreon and you'd like to, there is a link in the description below the video on YouTube. If you've got any questions or comments, as always, please leave those below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.